Welcome to Podcash, the portable professional development podcast from CASH alumni. CASH alumni is the fastest growing association of professionals in care, health and education, and we're happy to have you here. This is where you'll hear from specialists and experts from across our network. Here's what's coming up.
Adults have a choice. You can create a relaxed environment by being relaxed yourself, or you can create an environment where, everybody's slightly on edge because there's a timetable to hold to and, certain things have to be done in certain ways. And we've all got to make, Mother's Day card before the children go home. And so there's stress around that as well. Maybe there's something there around the children really benefiting from the adults creating a more relaxed environment.
Let's jump in to this week's episode.
Thanks very much for inviting me. My name is Shelly Newstead, and I'm the creator of a model of playwork practice called PARS, Playwork Practice, and that came out of a PhD that I did not so many years back now. That model of practice is now being used around the world to teach adults how to give kids some time and space to be kids when they're being supervised in things like after school clubs and adventure playgrounds and summer camps and hospitals and prisons and zoos and all sorts of places where children find themselves under the supervision of adults in their free time.
Can you tell us a little bit about what PARS is? Why is it different to other models that people might have seen before?
I suppose in playwork, we've always had a real problem. I've been working in playwork for several decades now. I won't tell you how many because it makes me sound too old. But ever since I joined the playwork field, we've always had a problem in saying exactly what playwork is and why it's unique and how it differs to other approaches to working with children. So when I came into the playwork field, we talked about loose parts, for example, and that was a key part of playwork. But actually, other people use loose parts. Early years teachers use loose parts. Primary school teachers use loose parts. There's nothing very unique to playwork about using loose parts, or some of the other theories that we've always drawn on. So why PARS is different is that it is actually a model, and it is the first model of playwork practice that has been developed, which describes the theories, the philosophy, the methods, and the techniques that playwork practitioners use when they work directly with children. One of the other differences with playwork is that we sometimes focus on the space in which the playwork takes place. So playwork's often associated with creating play environments, for example, for children. So it's sort of physical, if you know what I mean. It's got this sort of physical application to it. Whereas PARS is about the practice. It's about what the adults do and don't do when the child is standing in front of them. And that's quite unique in that we provide a way of adults describing only what they do, but also why they do it that way and why that is a PARS playwork approach rather than an early years or a teacher's approach, for example. And that's not because we think the other approaches are wrong, by the way. It's just different. It's unique. And that's what I set out to think about in my PhD. What is unique about playwork practice that's different from other approaches to working with children in their spare time?
That's incredible. So I think the first thing that stands out about that for me is that idea that you saw not a problem, but something that you wanted to, or that was missing in the system. And rather than go, oh, that's frustrating, that's just missing, you went, oh, I'm going to piece all of that together and do a big thing. So this must be something that you're really passionate about to have made a PhD of it. What is it that made you so passionate about PARS?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the honest answer is that I was deeply, deeply frustrated by the fact that there were things that kids did that I just found natural and quite often hilarious. And other adults were telling children off for it. So I was working in a school one day, and the children, I'd given the children foam swords, much to the head teacher's delight, as you can probably imagine. He wasn't that pleased. But the children took these foam swords and they decapitated a pink plastic hippo that was actually a rubbish bin on the playground. And I stood there and I laughed and I laughed and I laughed until the tears rolled down my face, because actually it was really funny. The playground was on a bit of a slope and this pink plastic hippo's head just rolled down the playground with these kids running after it, waving their foam swords, and it was just brilliant. And then I stopped laughing and looked around, and all the other adults on the playground were just stony-faced. They were just horrified, because for them it was destruction of school property. You know, the kids were behaving badly. They shouldn't have been doing that sort of thing. And that was my light bulb moment, if you like. That was when I thought, hang on a minute, why do I find that hilarious? Why do I think that's kids being kids? Isn't that great? You use the foam swords, they've invented their own game, and now they've captured a hippo. Hurrah! But these other adults are about to, you know, send these kids in to the head teacher's office and be told off for destroying school property. And I think that was the light bulb moment for me. That was what I wanted to know. You know, was I just being an irresponsible adult, perhaps? Maybe I wasn't a real grown-up. Or maybe there was a different way of seeing children's behaviour from a child's perspective that actually wasn't universally shared by other adults.
Why do you think it's so important for children to be able to play without that adult intervention instead of to be like kids be kids, as kind of you said before?
So my PhD research took me back to the literature of the adventure playground pioneers. And as a play worker, I'd always been sort of trained in that play work was about helping children to play. But what I discovered in my research was actually the adventure playground pioneers, where play work came from, were much more interested in children's ability to make their own decisions about what they did and how they did it in their free time. And that was a real shock for me, because I wrote a book called The Busker's Guide to Playwork, where I defined playwork as the art and science of facilitating play. And that's often quoted back at me. And I have to say, well, I got that wrong. I know better now. And I guess that's the, purpose of research, isn't it? But for the adventure playground pioneers, and I guess for me as well, it's really important that we as adults give children the time and space to be able to make their own decisions about what they do in their free time, for several different reasons. First of all, because children have a different way of seeing the world. They really do. They have a different approach to life very often that adults struggle to appreciate, particularly when it comes to things like risk. Now, adults are very prone to clamp down, oh, that's dangerous, be careful, stop that. Whereas very often the children have just got an idea in their head and they've done their own sort of risk assessments, and actually they're perfectly capable of making those decisions themselves. So there's a lot of scenarios in our practice where adults and children make different sorts of decisions. And that's not to say that children are always right, but in PARS what we do is think about the fact that actually there might be an alternative perspective, and that alternative perspective might be as valid as the adult perspective. Because very often what we do as adults is we take control perfectly reasonably, because we have to make decisions, particularly around safety. But when we apply those decisions, we don't take into account that there might be a different experience and a different way of seeing things, and that actually our experience might not be as valid as the children's in that particular situation. So we need to think as adults about different experiences of life, if you're a child or you're an adult, different ways of approaching the world. And just consider that actually in some situations, children might have an equally valid perspective to adults. And that's really hard sometimes, because adults are so used to being busy and being in control. and making decisions. And we do things very quickly, which is very different sometimes to the way that children do.
Now there's loads of things I want to ask you. So thinking about that, I think there's two main things that are jostling for position in my brain at the minute. And the first is about how that can be applied to just thinking about children's behaviour. So because there's those two perspectives and those two things, it might be that kids have just done a different risk assessment to adults and they don't think they're being naughty. They think they've made a really good decision and the adults just see it differently. And the other was sort of giving children the tools to understand when to apply their own decision making versus listening and doing as they're told by adults. So for example, my niece was really clever as a kid. She's still really clever, but she was really clever as a kid. And people, including her mum, kept telling her, "You're dead clever. You're much cleverer than your mum. Your mum much cleverer than me. Like, you're so clever." But that meant that my niece learned that she was cleverer than her mum and that she could make better decisions than mum could, and therefore was a bit naughty for a while. She wasn't being naughty. She was just taking all of the information that had been given to her and going, "I know, but mum's not always right." And she was making her own decisions. And once we understood that, we could work better with my niece to help her to understand the additional factors that she was missing in the bits of our puzzle to set our own answers up. How do you figure out when that's the crack and when you need to put more boundaries in place?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it goes to the heart of what the PARS model is about, because what PARS is not is it's not a set of guidelines. If a child does this, do this. Yeah. What PARS is, it's a set of tools to help you to make those decisions about when that adult perspective is necessary and when it's just superfluous, when really it's not necessary. But of course, the interesting thing about that is that it very much depends on the situation and the child in front of you. So very often people come on training courses and they say, "Last week, Johnny waved the stick around. What should I have done?" And our answers as PARS trainers is always, "I don't know." And then, of course, people get quite irritated and they say, "But you must know," especially when it's me. You developed the model. I get frustrated that I don't give them an answer. But as I always tell them, I can't make that decision because I wasn't there. You were the one who were looking at Johnny. You were the one who was deciding how big the stick was. You were the one thinking about what his face and his body language was telling you, how close the other children were, what happened just before he picked up the big stick. And so you've now got to make the decision about whether you saying, "Johnny, put that stick down," is appropriate in that particular situation or it's not. And that's one of the things that adults often find quite difficult with PARS to start with, because a lot of adults are trained in professions or disciplines where there are right and wrong answers. Now, the only right or wrong answer in PARS is that we do not want children to be unnecessarily or seriously hurt, and that goes for physical and emotional safety. So, of course, we're going to step in if we think there's any risk of serious hurt or harm on a physical or emotional level. But for everything else, then it's a judgment call. And even that is a judgment call, yeah, because what's safe to one person is not safe to another person. So PARS is a constantly reflexive practice of thinking about when am I sort of thinking about stepping in? Is that because of my perspective? Might in some cases be valid and necessary, or really, if I try and see it from the children's perspective, there might be other factors at play here, which means that I shouldn't therefore step in. So if I give you an example about behaviour that you mentioned, for example, one of the theories we use in PARS is Sturrock-Knowles's play cycle theory. And one of the things that adults often find really helpful is this idea of play cues. Because if you say to an adult, how do you know when a child wants to play? They often come up with things like, oh, well, they say, will you play with me? Or they'll ask in some sort of way. But actually, you can see children's actions as play cues that mean I want to play, which include things like throwing a ball at you. Okay, that's a fairly tame one. But some children might come and push you. Some children might come and kick you. Yeah? Some children might come and swear at you. And that's a cue for some children as to, I want to be chased. I'm going to pretend I'm playing at being awful to you so that you take notice of me, and then we engage in some sort of play chase where, you're going to pretend to be a bit of a pain or a bit irritated, whatever. But once adults start seeing play cues as potential signals that children want to play, then they start reevaluating some of the things that they would class as bad or naughty behaviour. So it's this thing all the time that's at the heart of PARS, which is about trying to see things from the child's perspective. Do we want children to go around swearing at other children? Probably not, to be honest with you. But we can at least think, oh, hang on a minute, it might be their way of communicating. It might be a potential play cue. Then we need to decide whether it's appropriate to do something about the swearing rather than just, jumping down the child's throat and say, you can't possibly say that, and all the rest of it. So it's thinking in the round, really, about how the child's experience might be different from the adult's experience. And then what do we do about that? Sometimes we have to apply the adult rules, boundaries, absolutely. And sometimes we can just step back and think, okay, yep, hadn't thought of it like that. Actually, I thought Johnny was picking up that big stick to go and really, have a go at somebody. But now I've watched for a couple of seconds, I can see that there's an imaginary dragon over there that Johnny is going to fight with that big stick. So actually, I don't need to shout across the field because actually he's just doing his own thing and he's having fun, and that would spoil his fun.
Introducing Cash Alumni Plus membership, your passport to exclusive features and professional development opportunities. You can now choose to elevate your membership experience and enjoy a host of enhanced benefits, including a brand new comprehensive library of e-learning modules and cashback discounts worth up to an average of £329 in savings per year. Expand your circle, exchange ideas, and stay ahead of industry developments with access to networking events both online and in person. Plus, with access to employment and career guidance sessions, you can confidently navigate your career path with personalised advice and job opportunities tailored just for you. Upgrade to Cash Alumni Plus membership for only £25 per year to access all these features and more. Head over to your member homepage or use the Join Us link in the show notes for this episode to find out more.
From what you were saying, I think it's very important, as you say, to kind of keep a balance in your approach and sort of being able to judge the situation. And I'm sure that can be hard, especially for practitioners not familiar with the model. So on that sort of, how would you recommend practitioners who are listening in could sort of start the journey with PARS and sort of where they could go to learn more about it?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. It is about that balance. So playwork has a bad reputation sometimes because playwork is associated very often with standing back and doing nothing. And for me, that's absolutely not what playwork ever was about, and shouldn't be, because as I say, sometimes, we do need to get involved in children's time and space, particularly for those safety reasons. But it is also quite difficult for adults to make those decisions, about when to step in and when to leave children alone, work things out themselves. And I also have to say that PARS isn't for everybody. Some people just are much better teachers or youth workers or social workers because that's the way that, they work. I would be a rubbish teacher, for example. It's just not my skill set. Yeah. And children need teachers and youth workers and social workers and, all those other things in their lives. So PARS isn't for everybody, but you can learn how to make these decisions about when to get involved and when to. And we run lots of different levels of courses. We start at level 1, and that's an introductory level. And that's really to get people informed about where we're coming from and why. It's a non-assessed course, and it's a nice, gentle introduction to the ideas and the philosophy of PARS. And at that point, some people go, yay, this is for me. Either this is the way that I've always been working, and I want to know more, and, I want to learn how to do this properly. Or some people go, oh, no, that's definitely not for me. No, that's just not something that I want to get involved in. And that's absolutely great. Everybody's got their own different skill sets and preferences about ways of working with children, which all bring benefits to children in different ways. For people who are interested in giving children time and space, we then have level 2, level 3 and level 4. And those are all accredited as customised qualifications by NCFE. They are all assessed. So there are trainers, and then there is assessment team for each course. And level 4 is our course that we put all of our trainers through to make sure that they are qualified at the highest level of PARS. Some people do level 2, and that's great. That's all they need. That's the sort of basics of how to use the model. Level 3 is our sort of advanced practitioner course. And you have to do a level 3 before you can do a level 4, because a level 4 is fairly academic. It involves referencing and reading papers and that sort of thing. So there's a variety of sort of levels that people can access the training at, which is great.
I like the idea that there's sort of a good stretch, so people can sort of come in at the level that's most appropriate for them. At the very beginning, you talked about the overlap between Playwork and some of the other parts of our audience, for example, so early years and people who work in certain care settings, and the different ways that we approach play in each of those settings, particularly with things like loose parts play. Listening to you describe the process that is involved in PARS, I was really struck by some of the conversations that I've had in the past with forest school practitioners, and the way that forest schools and farm schools and those really hands-on play-based settings work. I'm guessing this is something that you've considered and looked at as part of your research. So can you tell me a little bit more about where that crossover and where those links are between this approach and that forest school approach to play?
There's lots of interesting links to other approaches to working with children, and it's one of the things that I got into quite a lot in my PhD, because what I was trying to do was discover what was unique about a Playwork approach. And of course, I kept coming across things where the adventure playground pioneers who invented what eventually became known as Playwork were influenced by other approaches. So Carl Sorensen, for example, the guy who came up with the idea of adventure playgrounds in Denmark in the Second World War, he was very influenced by Maria Montessori, for example, and the idea of the competent child and those sorts of issues. So there are definitely similarities between things like Forest School and PARS Playwork. I suppose one of the key differences is that in PARS we wouldn't have outcomes for children to achieve. So the aim of PARS is to compensate children for the presence of adults in their time and space wherever possible. And that means that any outcomes, any sort of processes that the children want to follow are the ones that the adults want. Yeah. We want whatever the children want to do in their time and space, as long as it's safe and practical to do that. Whereas I guess one of the major differences with other approaches to working with children is that they very often have adult outcomes that need to be achieved. So in the case of Forest School, it is an educational-based practice, which fits nicely into the school curriculum, which is absolutely fine and wonderful. But yeah, in terms of PARS, there wouldn't be any sort of outcome for the children to achieve, except for to enjoy their time and space on their own terms, because PARS practitioners work in places where it is children's free time. So what we're trying to do is to make sure that that free time isn't taken up by lots and lots of different adults' agendas and outcomes, which of course are very necessary, but just done in other places.
I've now got a head full of questions about, I suppose, the outcomes of the project rather than the outcomes of the play. So with there being no outcomes to be measured in terms of the children's development or the reasons that they're playing or any of those sort of adult, I suppose, goals, objectives, things to fulfill from that play, how have you measured the success of the approach?
Very good question. And the short answer is we haven't. Well, not quite. Not yet. Yeah. So PARS is still relatively new. So when I finished my PhD in 2018, the aim was not to set up this huge international organisation with lots and lots of trainers teaching people in lots and lots of different countries. The model was really a conceptual framework to finish off what was essentially a piece of historical research into the adventure playground pioneers' theory and practices. But then what happened is people started to ask. So I was training in Hong Kong at the time, and I was trying out little bits of the model, and people were going back to their settings and saying, "Oh, this is great, Shelley, it works." And I was saying, "Well, that's very interesting, but it doesn't really matter because it's never going to be used. But it's lovely. I'm glad that, it works. And thanks for helping me to sort out my ideas in my head and, helping me to articulate that." But then people start to come and say, not only does it work, but we want to teach it. We want to take it back to our own countries. And so little by little, we have to set up this huge infrastructure to be able to help people who wanted to use it to use this model that I'd created at the end of my PhD. So the last sort of 5 years, I guess, have really been focused on that sort of practical aspect of what are we teaching, how are we teaching it, how we're accrediting it, how we're assessing it, and all the rest of it. And now we're getting into the research angle because we've got lots and lots of anecdotal evidence about what you would broadly class as outcomes, I guess, for want of a better phrase. But in terms of empirical research, there's not a lot at the moment. So one study was done in Hong Kong by Dr. Pauline Chan and her team, and she found that adults are less likely to get involved in children's risk-taking behaviours when they're trained in PARS. So she had a group that was trained in PARS by our Hong Kong trainers. And she looked at what they were doing before and after the training. And one of the things she found was that those adults were less likely to get involved in children's risk-taking behaviours and less likely to say things like, stop that and be careful. And the other thing that she found was that the children themselves were actually happier. They reported having more fun and enjoying their time in the kindergarten. That's one piece of research that has been published for quite some time. At the moment, we've got another project going on with Brunel University, and they're looking also at the children's experience of what happens when you put PARS into practice in a setting as a pilot project, hopefully a bigger study. And we're very fortunate in PARS. We've got a huge academic support network who help us to do things like run our academic journal, the International Journal of Playwork Practice, and speak at our conferences and help us to think about pieces of research and develop those. But anecdotally, what adults tell us is that they're less stressed and they're happier, and they don't spend so much time doing things like lots of planning and organising, and they're less, how can I put this? They're less sort of involved in children's sort of busyness unnecessarily. Yeah, they don't interrupt them so much, and they don't feel a pressure to have to keep asking children all the time, how are you doing? What are you doing? Why are you doing that? Because PARS isn't about outcomes for children. So we don't have to record, have the children progress today or have they had an appropriate amount of exercise. PARS is really about children's free time and space. Because the bottom line is that if they weren't in things like after school clubs, they may well be playing outside by themselves. And when they're outside by themselves or indoors by themselves, they're making their own decisions. They're taking risks that adults don't know anything about and probably don't want to be honest with you. Speaking as a parent myself. And they are making an awful lot of decisions for themselves that when they're supervised by adults, those opportunities for decision-making just get taken back. So adults are trying to compensate children by making sure that actually they're not making all the decisions for the children. They're not constantly structuring their time. They're not programming activities for the children to do. And they deliberately do that to give children that experience of having that sense of free time and what they might be able to do with that time in any given environment.
And you said that the children reported things being more fun. I know that you don't necessarily know the answer yet, but do you have any feelings about whether that is them being able to make their decisions, which I know you've mentioned, and how much of it might be being able to forget that they're being watched?
Yes, I think that might be the case, absolutely. And also I do think, so in PARS we use something called Playwork Mirror Theory. And mirror theory basically suggests that you are more likely to create the conditions that you want to see in other people if you replicate those conditions themselves. So in other words, if you want kids to be more relaxed, you have to be more relaxed. Yeah. And I'm sure, anybody who's a parent who's listening will know that, the minute that we as parents get agitated and anxious and frustrated, the kids just pick it up and they pick it up from us. And then we've got, a parent and child situation where the kid's getting more anxious and frustrated and we're getting more anxious and frustrated and we're bouncing off each other until things get to a situation where we both think, hang on a minute, how do we get to this? So the converse is hopefully also true. The more relaxed we are as adults, the more relaxed the children can be. And that goes for a parental situation at home or, an environment where you've got 160 kids in an Australian after school club, which sounds manic. But actually, adults have a choice. You can create a relaxed environment by being relaxed yourself and not organising and programming. Or you can create an environment where, everybody's slightly on edge and a little bit stressy all the time because there's a timetable to hold to and, certain things have to be done in certain ways. And we've all got to make, Mother's Day cards or whatever it is before the children go home. And so there's stress around that as well. And actually the children pick up on that programming and scheduling and, maybe there's something there around, the children really benefiting from the adults creating a more relaxed environment with PARS because the adults aren't so stressed themselves.
That makes sense to me as someone who's learning to play as a grown-up and learning to be a little bit more calm. And from the stuff that we've had at sort of previous Cash Alumni events, like the stuff around self-regulation in practice and that idea about co-regulation and again that will you pick things up differently when you're dead stressed and you give off a different impression than maybe you might want to when you're dead stressed and all of those things. But I can also hear the members of our audience who like order and who like routine and who like planning and timetables and all of those things. And I know that you've already said PARS isn't for everybody, but how can those people start to build in more freedom for children, I suppose, without feeling like, rather than freedom or relaxation, they're inviting chaos? Or sort of, I suppose a lot of people might not know where the line is between a relaxed setting and a negligent setting. How do you feel that out for the first time if you're a very planny type of person?
Yeah, I think there's all sorts of things to unpick there. So at the heart of the PARS model is a method called reflexive practice. And I think a lot of your listeners might be familiar with reflective practice. But we use reflexive practice, which is it's an academic term. And the difference between reflexive and reflective is generally, and this is broad generalization, but generally reflective is being reflective about what other people are doing, in this case, the children. But the reason we use reflexive in the PARS model is because reflexive is all about what I'm doing. And in this situation, it would be all about what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling as well. And so what the PARS model does is it asks us to look inside ourselves and to use this reflexive practice to think about one crucial question, which is it about me or is it about the kids? And that's really hard. And I don't want it, to sound like PARS is a therapy session like that. But we are there. The aim of PARS is to compensate children for the presence of adults wherever possible. And what that really does is that it puts into sharp focus whose aims are we here to serve. And in PARS, we're there to serve the children's aim to have some time out of the adult world, time to make their own decisions, to direct their own free time, and to do what matters to them from their own perspective. So I guess from a PARS perspective, starting with, well, I'm a timetable person, so how can I get timetables into PARS? Is sort of the wrong way around, if that makes sense to look at it. Because that then puts the onus of the children to meet our needs, the timetables of order and structure. Yeah. Whereas actually in PARS, we're there to focus on the children's needs for free time and space to do what matters to them. So there is obviously always rules, boundaries, regulations, and order and structure within a PARS setting or within PARS practice. Because children have to go home, right? We don't just say, oh, anything goes, play as long as you like. There are safety issues, for example. Sometimes children need help and support, and therefore we have to get involved. And maybe sometimes it's even a case of teaching kids things, they're building something. They don't know how to make something stand up straight. They need that adult knowledge and perspective. So in PARS, we talk about necessary adulteration. When is it necessary to put that adult perspective in? Or when is it that we're just doing that to meet our own needs? Now, our own needs might be to feel like we're doing something. Quite a lot of people, when they first use PARS, they say, I felt really guilty because it felt like I was just standing around doing nothing. And then the parents came in and they saw me just standing around doing nothing. And I know I wasn't doing nothing. I know I was thinking about whether children needed me or not. But actually, people struggle with that to start with before they get confident in being able to articulate what it is that they are doing. So we're always thinking about whether our adulteration is necessary or unnecessary. And we use different criteria to make that judgment in the PARS model. But we always use that reflexive practice to think about is this my needs that are being fulfilled, or is it about trying to help the kids to have some time to do what matters to them? And that's hard, because it often means that we have to break some of our habits and some of our habitual ways of working with children. And that is difficult. It's a difficult thing to start with.
Thank you, Bill. Oh, sorry. Just kind of popped a question into my head of how practitioners can navigate those parental family relationships when applying the PARS model. Because obviously, as we're talking through this conversation about that balance and sort of those safety issues and sort of that worry and kind of navigating those relationships with them.
Yeah, we talk in PARS a lot about putting your PARS hat on and taking it off, because you can't be a PARS practitioner all the time. If you're a teacher and you work in a classroom and then you go and supervise lunchtime outside, playtime, then of course you could put your PARS hat on and use PARS in the lunchtime break, which is where children do have free time. But in the classroom, you have to take your PARS hat off, and you have to then use your teaching curriculum, because there are things that you have to achieve as a teacher in order to make sure that children get the education they need. And it's the same with parents. I'm a parent myself. My boys are teenagers now, but they often say things like, "Oh, she's not using her Playwork voice anymore. We better do as she says." Because sometimes as a parent, you just have to say it's bedtime, or now it's time to sit and eat, and this is how we do it in our family, and this is the way it needs to be done. Because otherwise, children wouldn't get educated, they wouldn't get fed, and they wouldn't have any sleep. Family life is not free for all. It's parents have responsibilities to make sure that children are brought up in the way that they want them and need them to grow and develop. So very often PARS practitioners who are also parents will make changes in their family life. So one of the lovely things that happened when I first started teaching in Hong Kong was that people very often live in Hong Kong in very small apartments and very small flats, and often with extended family. And there were lots of lovely instances of the practitioners coming back and saying, "We had a family discussion last night, and we allowed our 3-year-old toddler to jump on our big double bed for the first time. And it caused so much happiness and joy in our family that we will be doing that again." And it sounds like that's a very small thing, allowing your 3-year-old toddler to jump on your bed. But actually, just think about it from the 3-year-old toddler's perspective. How much fun is it to be allowed to jump on the big double bed for the first time, and then to be allowed to do it again? That's a tremendous difference in a 3-year-old's life. And I think sometimes we forget that as adults, that small shifts in that adult perspective to think about what's really meaningful to children make a huge difference in the way that children experience life and can get so much more fun and joy out of life on a daily basis. So PARS doesn't say to parents, there's no rules, there's no boundaries. Of course there's rules and boundaries. There's always rules and boundaries, and it's up to parents to decide which rules and boundaries apply. But sometimes just shifting that perspective sometimes and asking, okay, do we do that because we've always done it that way? Or is there another way to do it? So again, in Hong Kong, one of the stories from parents has been, we deliberately take children out to play in the rain. We phone around all of our friends. We get them to put on their wellies and their wet weather gear, and off we go to the park to splash in the puddles. As a result of shifting that perspective about what actually can be done, even though we haven't really tried it before, and it's not a natural way of us to think as an adult.
That's great. And it reminds me, like when I was little, my mum was scared of thunderstorms. So we used to go out and dance on the patio in wet pajamas whenever it was thunder and lightning, so that I wouldn't be scared of thunderstorms. And now I love thunderstorms. They're the best thing ever.
Introducing Cash Alumni Plus membership. your passport to exclusive features and professional development opportunities. You can now choose to elevate your membership experience and enjoy a host of enhanced benefits, including a brand new comprehensive library of e-learning modules and cashback discounts worth up to an average of £329 in savings per year. Expand your circle, exchange ideas, and stay ahead of industry developments with access to networking events both online and in person. Plus, with access to employment and career guidance sessions, you can confidently navigate your career path with personalised advice and job opportunities tailored just for you. Upgrade to Cash Alumni Plus membership for only £25 per year to access all these features and more. Head over to your member homepage or use the Join Us link in the show notes for this episode to find out more.
You talked about putting your PARS hat on and taking your PARS hat off. Do you ever find yourself putting your PARS hat on when dealing with other grown-ups?
Oh, that's such a great question. In fact, yesterday we had a session with Taiwan. So we have a trainer, PARS Hub in Taiwan, and the trainer organised a session where I could meet some of their students because they learn in Chinese. I don't speak Chinese. Fantastic. She translated. We had a good old chat. It was fantastic. And one of the students there in Taiwan told me that she'd actually practiced PARS on her husband because actually she'd thought about this idea of different perspectives and applying it to children, and then thought, well, actually, my husband's got different perspective on things. And actually, if I put myself in his shoes sometimes and tries to see things from his perspective, maybe that will give me a different way of thinking about, how we relate to each other. And that was just such a lovely thing to hear, because I think that fundamentally what PARS is about is it's about respect. It's about respect for a different way of being and a different way of living and experiencing the world. But the problem is that fundamentally, because we're adults and the human beings that we work with, the children, we don't necessarily automatically think of that respect in terms of applying it in everyday sort of living. There's lots of movements about, children's participation and involving children and that sort of thing. And that's all great. But actually, they don't really touch that day-to-day experience where adults and children just meet each other in the street or at the swimming pool or in the supermarket. And then the adult takes control of the situation or assumes they're right or applies a rule just because they can, without taking into account that actually there might be a different way of seeing the world. So I'll give you an example. When my youngest son was very small, we went to the supermarket, and he naturally got a trolley. Excuse me. And he was getting his big brother to push the trolley, and he was riding in the space underneath the trolley. And I was watching them. Well, of course I was, because I'm a PARS Playwork practitioner, and to me that was a sensible thing to do, because supermarkets are super boring for children. They weren't causing any harm. There was no damage. They weren't going mad. But we're just pushing each other down the middle of this aisle, doing no harm to anybody. And then at the bottom of the aisle, the security guard came and told my children off. And I was outraged. I was absolutely outraged. And I went and said to him, I'm sorry. I said, but if my children are doing anything wrong, I will tell them off. And they're causing no harm. They're not damaging the trolley. They're not endangering anybody. There's nobody in the aisle. They're not bashing the trolley into things or freezers or whatever. Why do you think that it's your role to actually tell my children off when they're not doing anything that's causing any problems? And I do think that, sometimes as adults, we just lose that whole idea that, just as women and men, for example, have different perspectives, as my Taiwanese colleague pointed out, children can have different perspectives as well. And just because we have the power as adults to overrule them doesn't mean to say we always should. Yes, of course, sometimes we should, because it's safety and because there's stuff they need to know and there's stuff they can't do. But actually, we shouldn't misuse that power. Sometimes we just need to stop and think, okay, there's other ways of seeing things here. So yes, do I use it with adults sometimes? Absolutely, especially when they're telling my children off in supermarkets. And I don't think they should be.
That scenario actually kind of brought up another question in my head, and you kind of sort of started talking about it, and that was that practitioners will often face those challenges, especially in different environments, like the supermarket, where there will be differing opinions and people who don't quite agree with that approach. So how would you advise that they sort of act in that situation?
Yeah, and it's one of the big challenges, but also one of the benefits of PARS that people tell me, which is that because we have methods, theories and techniques and a named philosophy, that actually people tell me over and over again that what the PARS model does, it gives them the language to be able to articulate and to explain what they're seeing, how they're seeing it, what they're doing about it, what they're not doing about it, the decisions they're making and the judgments that they're coming to. Because certainly when I trained in Playwork, it was sort of a case of, oh, well, the kids are not hurting themselves, so, there's nothing I need to do. Well, that's okay. But when you have a head teacher, for example, who comes out and says, oh, I see you allowed the children to chalk on the playground, all over the playground. I'm sure next time you'll remember just to ask them to chalk in one small space. Actually, as a practitioner, you need some language to be able to articulate why that never occurred to you. Actually, why for you it's as important for the children to use the whole space as it is for the head teacher to have that contained in one small corner of the playground. Because the problem is, nobody's wrong there. Both opinions are equally valid. But actually, unless you've got the language to be able to explain the decisions you're making and how you're making them and why you've come to those conclusions, the danger is that we look at the very worst like we're being negligent, like we're not making decisions, like we haven't got any rationale for our practice. And so what people often tell me who do PARS courses is it's fantastic because now I can explain to my colleagues, to parents, to the head teacher, whoever it is that, I'm working with, what I'm doing and why that's different to their approach. And again, that's not to say that approach is better or worse than any other approach, but having that professional and technical language to be able to explain yourself is really empowering for PARS practitioners, is what they tell me.
Yeah, that makes loads of sense. I think we've seen some of that in early years as well, more recently with that focus on sort of like the EYFS and being able to talk about why you're doing different things. I think it's really helpful in combating that like weird narrative about just playing with kids or just doing whatever, like, because it isn't it's a whole thing and there's a real specialism behind it. And it's something that I, as a very much a sitting at a desk office person, do not have the skills or the tools to be able to do, let alone to talk about or justify. So I think that idea of giving people the tools to talk about things that already know is really, really valuable. I think we could probably talk to you all day because everything you say lights up 4 or 5 more questions in my head. But I am very conscious that we have 9 minutes left until the end of our recording time. So I think now is probably a good time to ask whether you have anything that you haven't had a chance to talk about yet that you'd like everybody to know, or if Magda has any other questions that she's dying to get in before the end of our 9 minutes.
My only question, it kind of already got brought up, and that was just talking about the international spread of this model. And I just think it's incredible that it's being used in so many different countries, including like China, Netherlands, Brazil. It's amazing. And I suppose this could be a quick question, but I wondered, how do you think it's become so adaptable? Like, what makes it so adaptable in such, in a way, differing settings, and yet sort of everyone can use it as well because it's so universal?
Yeah, and it's really surprised me, actually, and I'm just honoured and amazed that it's being used in so many different ways in so many different contexts. I think at the heart of the PARS model is the fundamental belief that kids are kids. And whilst, of course, there are cultural differences wherever we work and wherever our trainers are, the bottom line is that kids all over the world want to be curious and creative and experimental and fun and just to enjoy their lives from their own perspective. And so that is really what is at the base of our PARS approach. And I think that's why it translates so well into different countries and different environments and homes and schools and, spaces that are very fundamentally different from, summer camps to adults who work in prisons with children, for example, because kids want to be kids wherever they are. And I think the other reason that it translates so well is because, as I said earlier, it is a practice. So I can use PARS Playwork practice in an airport when I'm sitting waiting with bored kids who are not mine, by the way. I often carry a foldable frisbee in my handbag, and I've had many lovely games of frisbee in airports with bored children who are waiting for flights. And actually, what do children do when they get bored? Well, they, produce some behaviours which the adults then feel embarrassed about, and then there's an issue and all the rest of it. So, I get my frisbee out and we have some fun. And so it is a practice which can be used anywhere. So PARS doesn't have to happen in a specific space. And it's not about creating spaces for children either. What it is about saying where children find themselves spending their free time with adults, how can that time and space be more geared towards how the children want to spend their free time in that space rather than how the adults want that to happen? So I guess those two things make it very translatable and applicable across the world. And the other thing is, of course, our training team are all local people. So the people who, train in Brazil are Brazilian and delivering Portuguese, and we have Chinese trainers, and they make it relevant to the local context, which is just fantastic, and they do a tremendous job.
If our audience are anything like me, they're now sort of itching to go and find out more about all of the things that you've talked about so far. When people want to find out more, where can they find you online?
So very excitingly, the last few months, we've just set up our online learning platform, and that's www.parsplaywork.com. It's actually more than a learning platform. I mean, we do run all our training courses through there and all of our assessments, but it's actually a fabulous community space as well. People can chat to each other, connect with each other all across the world, share stories, and also get involved in lots of different projects that we're involved with. So even if people are not enrolled on current courses, they're very welcome to sign up to that website and just join in and see what we're all about, and connect with people around the world. It's a fabulous thing to be involved in.
Thanks for listening to Podcash. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe on your podcast app so you never miss an episode. You can also watch many of these conversations by heading over to cashalumni.org.uk and going to the CPD and best practice section of the site. That's cashalumni.org.uk.